Hi there and welcome to The Artist Craft. I'm your host Stacey Coc, and we have an excellent guest in studio today. J.A.JANCE is the New York Times best-selling author of the J.P. Beaumont series, the Joanna Brady series, and Allie Reynolds series, as well as 3 standalone thrillers. Born in South Dakota and brought up in Bisbee, Arizona, Jance lives with her husband in Seattle, Washington, and Tucson, Arizona. Thank you very much for being on the show today.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here.
Well, the new book is Damage Control, which I've got a copy of here. It is part of the Joanna Brady series, so tell us a little bit more about Damage Control.
People often want to know, well, where did you get the idea for this book? The idea for this book walked into my bedroom on the 17th of March of last year when our ailing golden retriever, who hadn't barked for 2 months, awakened us to let us know there was an intruder in our bedroom.
So the idea began there.
And so we tracked the guy down to a halfway house, and I write murder mysteries. This seemed like too good of an idea to pass up, and so it starts with a scene very much like that. The only difference is I used my literary license, and the intruder in that bedroom is dead as a doornail by the end of the first prologue.
Mistakenly, right?
Well, you can't say that.
Oh, I shouldn't say that.
You shouldn't say that. That'll give away too much.
Well, I don't want to give away too much of the book. One of the things
People won't remember that. It's fine.
One of the things I'm struck with about Damage Control is the multiple storylines that you're able to pull together. And yet, I've read that you don't outline. So can you talk a little bit about the process of writing Damage Control?
You're right. I hate outlining. I met outlining in 6th grade geography in Bisbee, Arizona. I hated outlining then. I hate it now. One of the reasons is I have a terminal fear of Roman numerals. If you can't do Roman numerals, you can't outline. So since I write murder mysteries, I usually start with somebody dead, and then I spend the rest of the book trying to figure out who did it and how come. In Joanna Brady's case, she is a sheriff. So she isn't just following one case. She's overseeing a number of cases. And that gives me the opportunity to have her doing more than one thing.
In writing series fiction, can you get to know your protagonist too much?
Writing a new book in any given series is always a tightrope walk because, yes, Beaumont and I have been together for 26 years. Joanna and I have been together for going on 20. And when I start a book, I have to remember that some readers, for some of my readers, this will be the first book they've ever read. So I have to give those readers enough of the ongoing character's background and the characters that are book specific. I have to give those new readers enough information that they'll feel like they got a whole book. I don't want to give them so much information that they won't want to go back and read the previous books. And on the other hand, I can't give so much information that my long-term readers are bored to tears. So it is difficult to make sure everybody has enough and not too much information.
Which of your series do you like the best?
I always like best the one I'm supposed to be working on next, as opposed to the one I'm working on now. But my mother said, you have to clean your plate before you have dessert. And so I don't let myself think about the next book until I finish the one I'm working on right now.
Now, we talked a little bit before you came on air about writing your first book. Think back to that time, before you wrote your first book, when you were thinking about the process of becoming, or the idea of becoming a published novelist.
Well, actually, I didn't think about it very long. I only thought about it for about 4 days before I started writing. That's one way of looking at it, and the other way of looking at it is that I always wanted to be a writer. I wanted to be a writer from the time I read the Wizard of Oz books in 2nd grade. I wasn't allowed in the creative writing program at the University of Arizona because I was a girl. And I married a man who was allowed in the creative writing program that was closed to me, and he said, there's only going to be one writer in our family, and I'm it. And so I put my writing ambitions on hold and didn't do anything about them until I was a divorced woman living in Seattle. And I was involved in a Dale Carnegie course where we had to speak about some incident that had changed the course of our lives. And I talk about how our paths had crossed the path of a serial killer back in 1970. And when I finished telling the story, one of my fellow classmates came up and said, well, somebody should write a book about that. And I thought, I'm divorced. What have I got to lose? That was Thursday night. I started writing that book on Sunday afternoon after church. And I wrote like a mad woman for the next 3 months. I finished the rough draft, handwritten, on the 22nd of May, which was the day we first encountered the serial killer. So it seemed, it seemed so
coincidental.
Yes, but the truth was, I wasn't allowed in that creative writing class, so I didn't know there were some things you should leave out, and the book was 1,400 pages long. No one ever bought that book. I found an agent who advised me to cut it in half, and I did, and she still wasn't able to sell it. But writing that book that didn't sell taught me how to do pacing, taught me how to write dialogue, taught me how to write descriptive scenes. So that was really on-the-job training. The second book I wrote, which was the first Detective Beaumont book, was bought by the second editor who saw it.
That's an amazing story. One of the things I'm struck with is you came from a difficult marriage. You later had this situation at the University of Arizona where you weren't able to get into the creative writing class. And then another story, when you wanted to teach, you may have said this just a moment ago, when you wanted to teach, they said, well, we don't have genre writers here.
Oh, yes. I was trying to write a book, and it was going to be my first hardback, and it was going to be based on the serial killer incident, but that serial killer was still sitting in prison in Arizona, and I didn't want to write a book that would call his attention back to me. So I had a contract and a check to write a book. I had a deadline for this book, and I had no killer. That caused my worst ever case of writer's block. It was so severe that year when my University of Arizona alumni magazine came, I read it from cover to cover, and at the back of the book it said that the newly reconstituted creative writing program at the U of A was just going swimmingly. And I said to my second husband, the nice one, I said, well, I graduated from there and I have all of these books out. Maybe they'd like me to come from Seattle to Tucson to teach for a semester in the sun. He said, call them up, ask them. So I did. And the young man I spoke to said to me, and this is a direct quote, we don't do anything with genre fiction here. We only do literary fiction. It was a miracle. I was healed of writer's block on the spot. And the crazed killer in Hour of the Hunter turned out to be a former professor of creative writing from the University of Arizona.
Well, and that sort of speaks to what I was kind of leading up to. It seems like these things that ticked you off, that made you angry, became the fuel for writing.
That's absolutely
mystery and
true.
suspense fiction.
I know that if I'm going to be writing a book, I need to write about something that's going to keep me interested for 1.5 years. It's going to take 6 months to write it, 6 months to edit it, and 6 months of being out on the road promoting it. And if it's just a flaky little idea that won't stand up to that kind of 1.5 years of scrutiny, then I can't write it. I need to find something that I really care about. I grew up in a town where we had two dentists, the good dentist and the bad dentist. The bad dentist was cheap. And the reason he was cheap is he didn't believe in Novocaine. So he left behind this whole town full of traumatized dental patients, of which I am one. But I've sort of gotten over it because in my 5th book, there's a dead dentist on the first page.
Well, it's got to be cathartic then.
Yes,
to be
it
able
does.
to take these things that really, you know, that are angering and frustrating, and then be able to turn it into work. And I bet that lends an emotional resonance to the writing.
And I think it also keeps me fresh because it keeps me interested in the process. And that's the other thing about outlining. I write the book to find out what happened. I write for the same reason people read, to find out who did it. Mm-hmm. And if I knew everything going into a book, I'd have no reason to write it, mm-hmm. other than finishing up so I can get the paycheck, which sort of, no. So for me, writing a book is the same process of discovery that it is for the readers. And I'm always surprised. I was writing the second book, the second Beaumont book, when I found out the guy I thought did it, mm-hmm. didn't. He couldn't have killed that person because he was locked up in a cooler the whole time. And people asked me later, well, didn't you have to go back and change the clues? I said, no, he was innocent the whole time.
Well, that's got to be amazing when you get to those moments. I know in my own writing, my own little writing, that when I get to those moments where a character does something that I didn't think that they would do before, you kind of chuckle at the keyboard and you're like, hey, I didn't see that coming, you know. And it's those are the fun moments. Those are the really
those are the
creative
aha moments. Yes, there's a real aha moment for Joanna at the end of this book when I think we're all mystified by our parents. We don't understand our parents because there's the generation gap. Mm-hmm. But Joanna has had this dreadful case of hero worship for her father. And that, excuse me, that sort of stands to reason because when a parent dies and the children are young, the parent who's dead is dead. But he's not going to do anything wrong ever again. And Joanna has been at war with her mother because her mother was the one who was still around telling her, oh, well, you have to do it my way. Excuse me. So in this book, I think Joanna begins to see just an inkling that maybe her father wasn't as perfect as she thought he was, and maybe her mother isn't as bad.
Yeah, you definitely get a sense of that. If you're just tuning in, the guest is J.A.JANCE. The book is Damage Control. It's part of the Joanna Brady series, and that segues nicely into the question that I had was, one of the things, this is the first of your books that I've read, I'll admit that up front, but one of the things...
It won't be the last,
and it won't be the last. No. One of the things I'm struck with about Joanna is how in control she is of her life, and she's rarely ever acts recklessly. She rarely ever says anything that would raise an eyebrow, except with her mother. You know, there's this one scene where she confronts her mother at this motel room, and
because she thinks her mother is skipping out on her second husband, and mm-hmm. Joanna goes there ready for bear and ready to really light into her mother, and of course she's completely wrong.
Did you ever have any confrontations like that with your parents?
Of course I had confrontations
where you said, you know, what are you
that.
guys doing?
I think Joanna's relationship with her mother is a reflection of my relationship with my mother in my late 20s and early 30s. Once I had kids and I started to get older, it was amazing how much smarter my mother was. But Eleanor is, in large measure, patterned after my mother. And you would think that would hurt my mother's feelings, but it didn't. She said, you know, I really like that Eleanor Lathrop. She said, she's the first character in fiction I ever met who really knows how the world works.
Well, go figure, you know.
So I obviously did her justice.
That's great. What were your parents like when you were growing up? Were they encouraging of reading and the arts? Where was that first impulse to become a writer encouraged, I guess? You've talked about reading
Bisbee is in the mountains. It took a long time for television to get over the mountain and down into Bisbee. And so we spent those long summer evenings with our dad reading us poetry from the treasury of the familiar. It was the schooner Hesperus that sailed the wintry sea, and I had but 50 cents, and the song of the shirt. And so there were always stories and words going around in our house. And
that seemed like a natural thing, to have a father who was receptive to reading and literature.
Actually, my father had ambitions to be a writer, but he was a farmer, and it was during the Depression. He went to college, and he wrote a short story, and the professor said that he obviously had cheated, that he hadn't written that story himself.
Did he take that as a compliment, or did he take that
injustice of that irked my father to his dying day. But actually, you see a portrait of my parents in this book. I call them Martha and Alfred. But everyone in Bisbee, Arizona will look at Martha and Alfred in this book and say, that, no matter what she calls them, that's Norman and Evie Busk. Because that was how they were. They always went on picnics. They always had the oilcloth tablecloth for the picnic table. My mother always poured the coffee out of the Scotsman thermos and she had Parkinson's. She shook like mad, but she never spilled any. They were married for 68 years and had never seen the movie Thelma and Louise, but I know they had planned their own Thelma and Louise exit. And then my father pulled a dirty trick on my mother. He had a stroke and he died. And he left my mother mad as a wet hen and without access to the car keys for 5 years. And she was not happy to be here. She had Parkinson's, she had macular degeneration. She made it clear to us that she was ready to be with Norman, who had no business leaving her alone. So when my mother died, I shed no tears when I knew that she was gone, and I didn't cry when I went to her funeral. But in this book, I create Martha and Alfred, and they go on their picnic. And after their picnic, I give them the blessing of their Thelma and Louise exit. And what interested me as both a daughter and a writer, although I didn't cry at my mother's funeral, I did cry when I was writing these scenes, because it was a way of mourning for my parents, but also a way of honoring them.
What does Arizona mean to you?
What does Arizona mean to me? It's a land of opportunity. It's a land of blue skies and jagged mountains. It's a land of self-reliance and people who are willing to work hard to get the job done. It's a place where your word is your bond. If you say you'll do something, you'll do it. Bisbee, Arizona was a wonderful place to grow up. The school libraries were open during the summer, and I drag our little radio flyer wagon over to the library, fill it up with books, and drag it home and take it back the next week.
Now Bisbee it's a mining town, right?
Well, it was a mining town.
Well, they still have a mine there, though, don't they?
They still have an open pit mine, and now that the copper prices are going up, they are starting some of those operations up again. But the underground mines are closed down, and the open pit mine is pretty much closed down. But when I was growing up there were probably 16,000 people. And the high school had about 800 kids. Now it's less than half that, I think. But what's happened is it's moved into being a tourist attraction rather than a mining community. And so the Bisbee I write about in the books isn't exactly the Bisbee that I grew up with, but it isn't exactly what Bisbee is now. It's a fictional construct, but I'm too lazy to make up everything, and so I use the real geography and I put bits of historical fact in the background of the books. You know, Arizona is a place where people look on outlaws like the Clanton gang and Geronimo with a certain admiration.
That's part of the cultural lore.
Yes, it is.
I'm wondering, growing up there as a teenager, you mentioned being in high school, there were about 800 students in the high school. Was the attitude among your fellow students from, say, the 8th grade through graduation, was the attitude, or was there a predominant attitude of, okay, this is where I want to stay the rest of my life, or is Bisbee a town that I want to move to Tucson, I want to move to Phoenix, I want to move somewhere else?
I think there was an urgency to get out of Dodge. The men who worked underground, the fathers, my father, my best friend's father, those men worked so hard, and they wanted their children to have an opportunity outside working in the mines. And a lot of the fathers would get their sons summer jobs in the mines so they could be miserable enough that they would appreciate the opportunity to get an education.
What has surprised you the most in 25 years of being a professional published novelist? What has surprised you the most that you might not have anticipated about the life of an author before that first book was published?
When I wrote about Detective Beaumont, I wasn't allowed in the creative writing program, but I was smart enough to put in what I knew. And I had spent 18 years with a man who eventually died of chronic alcoholism. And so when I started writing about Beaumont, I had him do the kind of drinking I had lived with for all those years. I was doing a signing of the 4th book. Now, we already established that I don't outline. I don't outline books and I don't outline series. But I was doing a signing down in Portland, and a lady came up to the table and she said, you know, Beaumont drinks every day. He has a drink of choice, and it's starting to interfere with his work. Does J.P. Beaumont have a problem? And I said, well, you know, these are books. But in the course of that set of signings, and I do at least 30 signings for every book, 6 other people asked me the same question, and I thought, you know, alcoholism is a disease of denial. No wonder the author is the last person to figure that out. So in book number 8, Minor in Possession, Beaumont goes into treatment, and there are now 10 books with him sober as opposed to 8 books with him drinking. A number of years ago, I heard from a young man who, as soon as he read his first Beaumont book in junior high, wanted to be a cop, served as an MP when he was in the service. When he got out of the Army, he said he was a raging alcoholic, but he still wanted to be a cop. So he got hired in a small jurisdiction in Texas. They put him through the police academy. And he said, on the day I graduated from the academy, I realized that if I was ever going to be the kind of cop Beaumont is, I had to get sober. And that he's now the police chief. I did not anticipate. I was just telling stories.
That's amazing.
And evidently, the way I put Beaumont's drinking story into the books really resonates with a lot of people, and it's evidently changed some people's lives.
It was enough of a catalyst in this fellow's life that it played a role.
Well, it got around his own personal denial in a way that having your wife tell you, hey, buddy, you're drinking too much is one thing. But seeing your friend Beaumont drinking too much and you start worrying about him, you can kind of see what's happening to you. So I did not anticipate that, but it's really, it's a wonderful feeling when it happens.
I can imagine. Now these, we're talking about the best stories of fans. What is it like when you come across a fan who feels that they own one of your characters? Does that ever happen? Where they say, you know, you did this and she shouldn't have done that? Or...
Oh, actually, I heard from someone who just wrote me a letter and said that she just can't tolerate the new woman in Beaumont's life. And 5 pages into the book, she was just ready to throttle her. And so I wrote back and I said, well, I'm sorry you were disappointed, but I'm not going to change the course of the series because one person hates one character. What I've found is when people are really annoyed by a particular character, it's probably because that character is just too close to the bone. And it's like having to look at themselves.
There's probably some truth to that. Tell us about reading The Wizard of Oz in Miss Spangler's 2nd grade Greenway School class.
Well, the books were over on the bookshelf under the window. I already wore glasses then. And in that class was a boy who actually stole my glasses at recess and hid them. And Mrs. Spangler checked everybody's desk and found them. And a few years ago, I received a letter from this person. He said, I understand that you write murder mysteries now. Do you remember so-and-so? I said, yes, I remember you. You're the one who stole my glasses. I never heard back from him.
Oh, that's amazing.
But if you finished your work early, you could go and collect one of those books and read. And I always finished my work early. Time to do those weekly those annual tests that you had to do. I'd scurry through mine as best as I could so I could read for a while.
Interesting. Well, if you're just tuning in, the guest is J.A.JANCE. I think we're just about out of time here. The new book is Damage Control. The series is the Joanna Brady series. There's the J.P. Beaumont series, as well as the Allie Reynolds series, and a couple of standalone thrillers. I thank you very much for being on the show today. I wish we had a little bit more time to continue chatting. I could keep talking forever with you, I think.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Stacey. It's been fun.
And for all of us here at RTN Channel 10, and specifically for the Artist Craft, I thank you very much for tuning in. Thank you.
When I bought my first computer in 1983, it was an Eagle computer with 128K of memory.